A narration script in 3 sections. Setting: the Oregon coast, 1804. The sea took the cormorant a little after midnight, and Eleanor Hartley went into the water still holding the chest. She did not remember deciding to hold it. She remembered the deck going vertical under her boots, and the sound the hull made when it struck the skerries. Not a crack but a long, grinding groan, like something enormous being pulled apart against its will. She remembered a lantern swinging loose, and a man shouting a name that wasn't hers, and the black water coming up the companionway faster than water had any right to move. And she remembered that when the deck threw her sideways, her arms were already wrapped around the iron-banded sea chest that had not left her side in 19 days, and that some animal part of her had decided she would drown before she would let go of it. She very nearly did both. The cold was not like cold. It was like being struck. It drove the air out of her in a single ragged bark and filled the space where the air had been with a pain so total that for a moment she forgot she was pregnant, forgot she was a widow, forgot her own name and the promise she carried, and everything except the need to get her face above the surface. She kicked. The chest, God help her, floated. The men who built it had sealed it against exactly this water, and it rode the swell like a stubborn small boat, and she clung to one of its iron handles with both hands, and let it carry what it could of her weight, while the rest of her fought the sea. A wave lifted her, and she saw, for half a heartbeat before the trough swallowed it again, a light. It was high up and far off, and it swung across the dark in a slow wheeling arc. There and gone, and there again, and Eleanor Hartley, 13 years old and 8 months along and 1 hour into being the only living soul of the cormorant, fixed on that light the way the drowning fix on anything that is not the water, and she began impossibly to swim toward it. Before we go any further into Eleanor and S story, if this is the kind of tale that speaks to your heart, take just one moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and drop a comment below telling me what town you caught watching from tonight. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels across this world of ours. Your support means everything to me, and I promise you, what happens to this woman before the sun comes up is something you do not want to miss. Now let's go back to that cold black water off the Oregon coast and find out what kind of man keeps a light burning on a rock the whole world has learned to fear. Silas Vane had not slept a full night in 3 years, and he had stopped resenting it. He was awake now because he was always awake at this hour, and because the storm had been building since afternoon in the particular way that told him the night would be bad. The glass falling, the gulls gone quiet and inland, the swell coming in long and oily and wrong. He had climbed the tower at dusk and trimmed the wick and set the great lamp turning, and he had stood at the gallery rail for a while in the wind with his coat collar up, watching the weather come, feeling the old lighthouse shudder around him, the way it did when the sea meant business. He was 13 in and looked older, and the extra years had not been given to him gently. He was broad through the shoulders and spare everywhere else, a man worn down to the essential parts, and he wore his silence the way other men wore an old coat, something he put on one terrible morning and never found a reason to take off. He kept the Sable Point light because it was the loneliest posting on the coast, and because loneliness was the only medicine that had ever done him any good. The Lighthouse board sent him oil and wicks and a supply tender 4 times a year, and otherwise left him to himself, which suited them and suited him. He talked to the lamp. He talked to the 2 goats and the gull with the broken foot that had adopted the station. He did not talk to people because talking to people meant caring what became of them, and Silas Vane knew exactly, precisely, to the hour, what it cost a man to care what became of people the sea could reach. He had learned it on a night not so different from this one. He did not think about that if he could help it. He had gotten very good at not thinking about things he could not change. He was in the lantern room checking the clockwork when he heard it. Under the wind, under the boom of the surf on the skerries, a sound the storm had no business making. He went still. 3 years of listening to this coast had taught him its whole vocabulary, and this was not in it. It was too high and too broken and too much like a voice. He went out onto the gallery, down below and to the north, where the beam swept the water on its turn. He saw the wreckage. Timbers, a shattered length of rail, the pale flag of a torn sail spread on the black water like something dead. And there, in the wash where the rocks gave way to the crescent of gravel beach the keepers called the cradle, he saw a shape that the sea was trying to take back and could not quite manage, a dark bulk with something clinging to it, and the something was moving. Silas Vane was down the tower stairs and across the yard before he had decided to move at all. He grabbed the coil of rope from the boat shed and the lantern from its hook by the door, and he went down the cliff path at a speed that would have killed a careful man, the wind trying to peel him off the rock the whole way down, and he hit the gravel of the cradle running. She had gotten herself into the shallows. That was the thing he would remember afterward, that by the time he reached her, she had already dragged herself and the chest past the worst of the undertow into water that only came to her waist, and she was still moving, still hauling, still fighting to get the both of them up the beach with the last of whatever she had left. She had run out of it about 6 feet short. She was on her knees in the wash, with her arms locked around the chest and her head down and the surf breaking over her back, and she was not going any farther, and she was not letting go. He got an arm around her. She came up out of the water swinging. It was a wild, exhausted, half-drowned blow, and it caught him across the jaw with more force than have credited, and he took it and did not let go of her. "I've got you," he said, close to her ear over the wind. "I've got you. You caught her on land. You caught her alive. The chest." Her voice was a wreck thing, saltraw and shaking. "The chest comes, or I don't the chest comes," he said. "Hold on to me." He got her up. He got the chest up. It took everything he had and hers besides, and he understood in that moment that whatever was in it, it was heavy enough and dear enough that she had chosen it over air in the water. He half carried her up the cliff path with the rope around them both, and the chest dragging behind on the line, and the storm screamed the whole way up, and the woman in his arms said only one thing more before they reached the top. She said, "There were others." "I know," he said. "You have to look for the others." "When it light," he said, "I'll look. There. 'S nothing a man can do on those rocks in the dark but die with them. I am sorry. There's nothing to be done till it light." She stopped trying to argue. He felt the fight go out of her, not surrender. He learned she had no surrender in her, but the practical acceptance of a fact she couldn't change, and she let him take her the rest of the way inside, with the door barred against the wind and the fire built up until it roared. He got his first real look at her, and the look told him a story he did not like. She was young and she was strong and she was unmistakably heavily with child. Her dark hair had come entirely loose and lay plastered to her skull and her shoulders. Her lips were the wrong color and her hands, when he pried them off the chest handle at last, would not fully open, the fingers locked into hooks by cold and by however many hours she'd been holding on. There was a shallow cut over one eyebrow and gravel ground into both palms, and a bruise coming up along her cheekbone. She was shaking so hard the chair rattled under her. He did the things you did. He'd done them before, for shipwrecked men in his first year on the rock, before the sea had taught him its harder lessons. He got the wet clothes off her, brisk, impersonal, a keeper. Business and nothing else, and wrapped her in every dry blanket the station owned, and got hot water into her by the spoonful because a body that cold couldn't be trusted with a cup. He built the fire higher. He warmed stones at the hearth and packed them around her feet. And slowly, over the better part of an hour, the terrible gray left her skin, and the shaking eased from a convulsion to a shiver, and her eyes, which he thought were brown but were nearer to gray, storm-colored, began to track him around the room with a wary, measuring intelligence that told him she was going to live and had already started deciding whether he was a danger to her. "What's your name?" she asked. Her voice had come back a little. "Silas Vane. I keep this light. Silas Vane," she repeated, filing it somewhere. "Is this your family's station?" It was a shrewd question, and he understood it. She was working out whether there were other people here, a wife, sons, whether she been carried into a household or into a lone man's house. She was working out how much trouble she might be in. "There no family," he said. "It just me, has been 3 years." He set another warm stone by her feet. "You are safe here, Mrs. Hartley," she said. Eleanor Hartley. A small pause, flat and practiced, worn smooth from use. "My husband is dead. It's just me and..." Her hand went to the swell of her belly, and something in her face changed, the wariness swamped for a moment by a fear so much larger than the fear of him. "And this one? Did the fall, the water?" "I can tell you that," Silas said gently. "I am not a doctor. But you caught warm now and you breathing, and I guess if something had gone badly wrong you know it by now. Rest is the thing. Warmth and rest." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, they had gone hard and steady again, and she looked at him for a long moment the way people usually look at strangers, like she was trying to read something written behind his eyes and would decide a great deal by what she found there. "There. It's a U.S. revenue cutter that works this coast," she said. The Walcott. Does it call here? He didn't answer right away. It was an odd question for a woman who'd been in the sea an hour ago, and he'd learned to notice odd things. Twice a month when the weather allows, he said slowly. Signals the light on the way north, puts in at Dunmore. Why does a shipwrecked woman want to know the movements of a revenue cutter, Mrs. Hartley? She held his gaze. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her. Or perhaps she simply understood she had no better option than the man in front of her, storm outside and the sea at the bottom of the cliff and a child a month from being born. Because there are things in that chest, Eleanor Hartley said, that I have to put into the hands of a federal officer, and there are men in this world who would rather see me at the bottom of the sea than let me do it. She drew a breath. I think one of them may already have tried. The wind hit the tower. The old light shuddered. And Silas, who had spent 3 years keeping a fire burning for ships, he learned not to grieve, looked at the woman the sea had thrown at his door and felt something turn over in his chest that he did not have a ready name for. Sleep first, he said. Whatever this is, it'll keep till morning. And in the morning I go down to those rocks and look for the others, and then you and I will talk about your chest. He picked up the lantern. There's a bed in the back room that stays warm off the kitchen chimney. It's yours. Bar the door if it makes you easier. I'll be up in the tower. You don't sleep? Not much, he said, not for 3 years. And he went up to keep his light. There were no others. Silas was on the rocks at first gray light before Eleanor woke, going over the skerries and the length of the cradle and the tidely north and south, with the grim thoroughness of a man who had done this before and hoped never to again. He found wreckage enough to break a heart. He found a child, shoe and a Bible swollen to twice its size and a sea-trunk stove in and emptied by the surf. He found one of the cormorant crew, a young man, past any help, and he carried him up and laid him in the boat shed and covered him and took off his hat for a while in the cold wind. But there were no living others. The sea had taken all of them but the one woman who refused to be taken, and Silas Vane stood on the rocks in the dawn and understood, with the particular clarity that came to him only here, at the edge of the water, that Eleanor Hartley had lived because she had decided to and for no other reason the world would recognize. He'd known men like that. He'd been married to a woman like that. Once he climbed back up as the sun came clear of the coast range, and he found her in the kitchen. She'd found her clothes drying by the fire and put them on, and she found the coffee and the meal and made both, moving slowly and carefully around a body 8 months burdened, and she'd set 2 places at the table without asking whether that was welcome. She looked up when he came in, and she read his face before he said anything. The way he already learned she read everything, she said. I am sorry. There was one of the crew, Ivy, seen to, decent, the rest the sea has. She was quiet a moment. Then she nodded, once precisely. The note of a woman putting something heavy down in its proper place because there was nothing else to do with it. Thank you for looking, she said. Sit and eat. You've been out on those rocks 2 hours in the cold, and there. No sense you starving to do it. He sat. He was not used to being fed at his own table, and it did something to him he wasn't ready to examine. They ate in a silence that was not comfortable and not hostile, a silence full of things not yet said. When they got through half her plate, he noticed she made herself eat, methodically the way a soldier eats, fuel and not pleasure. She set down her fork and looked at him. You want to know about the chest. When you ready to tell me? Ready. She folded her hands on the table. Her scraped palms were wrapped now. He'd done it the night before and she'd let him, crimson with the effort of accepting help and saying nothing about the difficulty. My husband was Thomas Hartley. He was a clerk. Ship-ass clerk? Cargo clerk, whatever wanted clerking, a small, careful, patient man who kept the best books on the northern coast and could find a farthing wrong in $1,000 manifest. Her voice softened and steadied at the same time, the way a voice does over a name that still hurts. His last position was with the Marsh Mercantile Company out of Dunmore. Josiah Marsh outfit, the biggest concern in the county, freight, salvage, chandlery, half the harbor front. Marsh sits on the harbor commission. Marsh has the ear of everyone who matters between here and Astoria. She paused. Marsh is also, my husband discovered, a wrecker. Silas set down his cup very slowly. Explain that word to me the way you mean it. I said Eleanor Hartley. That ships do not go onto the skerries, only because God and the weather put them there. I mean that for the better part of 6 years, a vessel with the right cargo, insured for the right sum, passing this coast on the right dark night, has now and again seen a light where a light should be, low down, near the water, where a man with a lantern and a knowledge of these rocks might set one. And the master, taking that light for a safe anchorage or a harbor mark, has altered his course toward it, and found the skerries. She let that sit. Thomas found a pattern in the company's own books, salvage claims that came too easily, cargoes bought cheap off wrecks that Marsh Mercantile always, somehow, happened to be first to reach. Insurance money, payments out to men whose work was never named. He found it because he looked harder than the men who kept the books before him, and because he could not make himself stop looking once he false lights, Silas said. His voice had gone very quiet. There is a particular horror to a man who keeps a true light in the idea of a false one. They set false lights on this coast, perhaps on that very rock you keep. She watched him take it. Thomas made copies of everything, the salvage ledgers, the insurance correspondence, the pay records with Marsh, own hand on them, a map of where the false lights were shown and which wrecks followed. He put it all in that chest, and he went to file it with the Revenue Service, because wrecking and the plundering of insured cargo is a federal matter, and the local law in Dunmore is Josiah Marsh law, bought and kept. She stopped. Her jaw tightened, and before he could make the journey, he took a fever, and the fever took him. 4 months ago now, and on the last clear night he put the key of that chest into my hand, and he made me promise. Get it to the cutter, Nell. Get it to a federal man. Someone the sea took should get an answer for it, and I am the only one who found out why. Silas was very still. Outside, a gull cried, and the surf worked steadily at the base of the rock. You've been carrying this 4 months, he said. Alone, like this. He didn't gesture, but his eyes moved once to the swell of her. I wrote to the Revenue Service in Portland when I first understood what Thomas had. I got back a courteous letter telling me to submit any documentation through the proper local channel, which is the Dunmore Harbor Commission, which is Josiah Marsh. A short, mirthless breath. Either the letter was read before it was answered, or the answer was the trap. Either way, I stopped trusting the mail. I sold what the bank hadn't taken, and I took passage north to Astoria, meaning to reach the district cutter station and put the chest into an officer, says hands myself, face to face, where no clerk of Marsh could intercept it. She looked at him levelly. I took passage on a cormorant, out of Dunmore, and 2 nights out in fair weather? She went on to the skerries in the dark. The kitchen was very quiet. You think she was wrecked, Silas said. I think, said Eleanor Hartley, that a ship in fair weather does not strike the one set of rocks on this whole coast that her master had every chart in the world telling him to fear. I think a woman got aboard at Dunmore with a chest she would not let out of her sight, and I think word of that traveled the length of the harbor front before we cast off, and I think somebody showed the cormorant a light. Her voice did not shake. That was the thing that unsettled him most, that she could say it, all of it, without shaking. 13 people were aboard that ship, Mr. Vane. I am the only one the sea gave back. I have thought about very little else since I woke up in your kitchen, and I have not yet found a way to make that a coincidence. Silas Vane looked at the chest, which they carried in from the entry and set against the wall, iron-banded oak, salt-stained, streaming still onto the flagstones. He looked at the woman across his table, and he made a decision that 3 years of careful, deliberate solitude had built every wall in his life to prevent. Open it, he said. Show me. If I am to keep it under my roof, and it seems I am, I'll know what it is I am keeping. And he paused, and the next words came harder, because they were the truest ones. They said in 3 years, and if anything should happen to you, there ought to be one other soul alive who knows what your husband found, and can carry it the rest of the way. That's how you keep a thing safe, Mrs. Hartley. You don't carry it alone. Something moved in her face. It was not quite softness. It was older and harder than softness, and closer to gratitude than she had admitted. She took a cord from around her neck, and on the cord was the key, and she fitted it to the lock with hands that had gone perfectly steady, and she opened her dead husband, chest on Silas Vane's kitchen table in the pale grey light of the sea. It was all there, as she said, and more. Silas went through it the way he did everything, with his full attention and no hurry, and what he saw built a case in his mind, plank by plank, until it stood up whole and could not be argued down. Thomas Hartley's hand was small and exact. He had drawn a chart of the coast, and marked on it, in red, the places where false lights had been shown, and the wrecks that had followed each, with dates, with the names of the ships, with the tonnage lost. He had copied out salvage claims and set beside them the insurance sums, and the pattern in the numbers was as plain as a road once you knew to look. And at the bottom, wrapped separate in oilcloth, was a bound ledger. The private accounts, the second set, the payments out. One name signed the authorizations, over and over, 6 years deep. Josiah Marsh, not the company, the man, his own hand. He kept his own book, Silas said, half to himself. Even the careful ones keep a book. They can't help it. They want the reckoning of what they've built. He'll want that book back, Eleanor said quietly. More than he ever wanted anything. It hangs him. There is no defense against a man's own hand for 6 years running. She looked at the ledger the way you look at a live coal. As long as this exists, and as long as I am alive to say where it came from and how, Josiah Marsh is a dead man walking. Which is exactly why he needs the both of us gone. Silas closed the chest gently. He sat with a moment. Then he said the thing that had been forming in him since the beach. The Walcott's due north past this station in 9 days, he said. She signals the light and stands on for Astoria. If I show her the recognition, she'll heave to and send a boat, she obliged to. It the standing signal for a keeper in distress or with intelligence to pass. 9 days, Mrs. Hartley, and I put you and your chest into the hands of a revenue officer of the United States, on the deck of a federal ship where not all of Josiah Marsh money can reach. He met her eyes. 9 days. Can you keep for 9 days? She looked at him for a long time. The baby. It's not due for a month, she said. I can keep. And then, more quietly, why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't know that any word of this is true. Silas was quiet a while. When he answered, it was not the easy answer. I keep a true light, he said, so that no ship comes onto these rocks in the dark, and no family waits for men who want to come home. That's the whole of what I am now, and it's little enough. And you, V just told me there are men who set false ones, who do on purpose, for money, the exact thing they given my whole ruined life to preventing by accident of weather and dark. He looked at his hands on the table. I couldn't ride past that if I wanted to, and I find I don't want to. That's your answer. It's the only one I've got. He stood and picked up the chest and carried it to the base of the tower, where a keeper's storeroom ran back into the living rock, dry and dark and cold. He set it there behind the spare oil casks, where no man searching a station would think to look until he'd given up on every likelier place. It stays here, he said, 9 days. And nobody but you and me knows it on this rock at all. But somebody did. Silas found the first sign of it on the 4th day, when the weather had cleared and he'd taken the station skiff around the point to check his mooring, and saw drawn up on the beach at Dunmore, near cove where no boat of his own kept, a launch he didn't know, long and low and built for speed, the kind of boat a rich man company kept for reaching wrecks first. It was gone by the time he rounded back. But that evening, from the gallery with the glass to his eye, he watched 2 men on the headland across the water, sitting a long while in the failing light, doing nothing but looking at his light. Travelers didn't sit and look at a lighthouse for an hour in the cold. He came down and told her plainly, because they learned in 4 days that she wanted the truth flat, without softening, and used it better than most men would. Eleanor took it standing, one hand on the table, working it through the way he'd already come to recognize, the same instinct her husband had had to understand a thing all the way down before deciding what to do about it. They don't, he'd know it, here, she said. They can, if they knew, they have come already. They know the cormorant went down. They know they didn't find me among the dead, and they didn't find the chest in the wreck. Her eyes came up. They caught her watching the coast for either. And a lone light on a lone rock, with a keeper who suddenly rode to town for nothing 4 days after a wreck, is exactly the kind of thing a careful man would watch. You think this is Marsh doing? I think a launch that reaches wrecks first is a wrecker boat, she said. And I think men who set false lights on this coast know your rock better than you? She pressed her lips together. How many days to the cutter? 5 days, Eleanor said. We only have to keep them from being certain for 5 days. If they cut only watching, they won't move against the U.S. lightkeeper on his own station on suspicion. Marsh does. He do anything on suspicion. He waits until he's sure, and then he makes it look like weather. She looked at him. So we don't let him get sure. You go about your keeping. I stay off that gallery and away from every window that faces the water, and we count the days. They counted the days, and in the counting, in the long ordinary hours between the watching and the fear, the thing between them that neither had named went on quietly building itself. Plank by plank, the way the case against Marsh had. He taught her the light, how the lamp was trimmed and the wicks changed and the great lens turned, the whole grave nightly liturgy of keeping a fire burning against the dark. She was interested in the way she was interested in everything, hungrily, exactly, And she learned it fast, and one night when his hands were bad with the old cold age, the storms left in them, she trimmed the wick herself while he talked her through it, and the beam swept out, true over the black water. And he stood behind her in the lantern room and felt something he sworn off feeling. They talked over the fires, the way two people talk who have both survived the worst thing and recognize it in each other. She told him about Thomas, methodical, gentle, a small man who was not brave the way stories meant brave and was braver than any man she'd known, because he was afraid and did the thing anyway. And Silas, who had not spoken of it in 3 years, found himself telling her about the night that had made him what he was. I had a wife, he said into the fire, not looking at her, Mary, and a daughter, Ruth. She was 6. His voice was flat and old, the flatness of grief long survived and never resolved. I kept a light down the coast in those days, a smaller station. And there was a night the tender was due, and Mary wanted them to come out and meet it. Her and Ruth, a treat, a bit of the world after so much rock. And the weather turned while their boat was on the water, faster than it should have, and he stopped. Started again. I saw it happen. From the gallery, with the glass. I saw the boat go over and I could not get down the rock and out to them in time. No man could have, and I have told myself that 10,000 times and it has never once made a difference. He looked at his hands. I keep this light because it's the one useful thing a man like me can do about the sea. And I keep it alone because I learned what it costs to have something out there on the water you can't save. Eleanor did not fill the silence with comfort. She had the grace not to. She let the fact sit there between them, the way he had let hers, because sometimes a thing has no meaning to be found in it, and the only respect you can pay it is not to pretend otherwise. And after a while she said, very simply, you couldn't have saved them. I believe you know that, and I know it does help. But I am going to say it anyway, plainly, so it adds on the record between us. You couldn't have saved them. And you kept the light through it. That's not nothing, Silas. That very close to everything. He looked at her across the fire, this woman the sea had thrown at his door, 8 months burdened with another man's child, carrying a dead man's promise up out of the water on her own 2 hands. And something that had been nailed shut in him for 3 years moved. Just a fraction. Just enough to let in light. On the 8th night the watchers stopped watching. Silas noticed it because he'd trained himself to notice the shape of things, and the shape of the coast that night was wrong. The launch had not put in at the near cove. The 2 figures had not taken their post on the headland, and a man who has learned the sea knows that when a thing that has been circling suddenly goes still, it is not because it has lost interest, it is because it has decided. They caught her not watching tonight. He told her low, at the kitchen table, the lamp turned down, which means they mean to be doing something instead. I think they made up their minds. I think tonight or tomorrow night they come. Eleanor Hen went to her belly, the habitual check, and stilled there. Her face did not show fear, it showed calculation, which he had come to understand was her form of courage. The cutter's tomorrow, she said. The cutter tomorrow if the weather holds and if she is on time. And they know it too if they know the coast. So it'll come before she does, tonight. He stood and went to the cabinet where he kept the station, single old rifle and the pistol the board issued keepers on rocks like this one. And he checked them both with the unhurried hands of a man who has decided something and is only now doing it. Which means we have got to get through one night, Eleanor. Just the one, and in the morning I light the recognition signal and the Walcott comes, and it finished. She looked at him. There, something you should know about tonight then, she said. Something about the light, tell me. If they mean to make it look like weather, Eleanor said, slowly. The surest way, the wrecker way, the way that's worked 6 years running on this coast, is not to storm a lighthouse and shoot a keeper. That's a federal crime with a rope at the end of it, and Josiah Marsh has never once in his life done a thing that put his own neck in the noose. She looked toward the dark tower. The surest way is to put out your light. A keeper found dead at the foot of his own dark tower, the woman he was sheltering drowned in the wreck of a skiff that tried to run for shore. That's not murder, Silas. That's an accident. That's the sea. That's exactly the story Marsh has sold 6 times already. Her grey eyes came up to his. They curry not coming for the chest. They gave up on the chest when the cormorant went down. They curry coming to put out your light and make 2 more deaths look like weather. Silas Vaney stood in his kitchen with the rifle in his hands, and understood that the one thing he had left, the one useful thing, the fire he'd kept burning alone through 3 years of grief, that was the very thing they meant to take, and he understood, all at once and completely, that he was not going to let them. Then we keep the light, he said. Whatever else happens tonight, Elena, the light stays lit. Do you understand me? If it comes to it, and it may, you keep the fire burning up in that tower while I hold the door below. Because that light lit at dawn is the whole case. A dark tower is their story, a lit one is ours. As long as that beam is turning when the Walcott comes past, everything your husband died for is still standing. She looked at him a long moment. Then she nodded once precise. The light stays lit, she said. The light stays lit, he answered. And outside the sea worked at the base of the rock. And somewhere on the dark water a fast boat was already coming. They came in the black hour before moonrise, and they came quiet. Silas heard the launch before he saw it. The muffled dip of oars, someone taking pains, the sound carrying to him across the still water because he spent his life learning to hear exactly this. He was on the gallery with the glass, and he found them. 3 men in the launch, standing in for the cradle, the little crescent beach where a boat could land and where, 8 nights ago Hidi carried a drowning woman up out of the surf. 3 men, and he did not need to see their faces to read their purpose in the way they moved. Men who were comfortable around violence. Men being paid to do the thing other men wouldn't see. He went down. He already made his plan in the flat cold way that came over him at the edge of the water, and there was no more time now for anything but the doing of it. They carry landing at the cradle, he told her, low and fast, in the lantern room where he'd brought her, the highest, most defensible point, and the point where the light lived, which was the whole of what mattered. 3 of them. I am going down to the base. There is one door into this tower and I mean to hold it. You do the one thing, Elena. You keep the lamp turning. Whatever you hear below you, whatever it is, you keep that fire lit and that lens turning and you do not come down. Can you do that? Her face was white in the lamp, but her hands, when she took the trimming tools from him, were steady as stone. I can do that. If it goes bad, it's not going to go bad, she said, with a fierce flat certainty that he chose in that moment to believe. You are going to hold the door, and I am going to keep the light, and the sun is going to come up, and the cutter is going to come. Go, Silas. And she caught his sleeve, one hard grip, the same as she grabbed him in the surf. Come back up those stairs. You hear me? You come back up. Something moved in his chest, warm and terrible. I'll come back up, he said. And he went down into the dark to hold the door. What followed, Eleanor Hartley heard rather than saw, and heard it while her hands kept moving. She kept the lamp turning. That was the thing she held on to, the one clear instruction in a world gone suddenly to violence below her. She trimmed the wick and tended the flame, and kept the great lens wheeling on its clockwork, and the beam swept out over the black sea, around and around, steady and true, exactly as it had every night this light had stood. She heard the first shout below, and the boom of the old rifle in the stone stairwell magnified into something enormous, and men's voices, and the crash of the door, and she did not go down. She heard a cry of pain that was not Silas, and then one she was terribly afraid was, and her whole body strained toward the stair, and she did not go down. She kept the light. Because he told her the light was the case, the light was the truth. The light was everything Thomas had died for, and everything Silas had given his ruined life to. And she had made a promise, and Eleanor Hartley did not break promises. She had proven that across 4 months and 300 miles and one cold sea. She kept the light. Below her, in the dark at the foot of the tower, Silas Vane held the door. He was 1 man against 3, but he was 1 man in a stone tower with a single entrance, in the dark, on his own ground, and that counted for more than the arithmetic suggested. He braced the door with a spare mooring timber, and he held the stairwell above it with the old rifle. And when they broke the door he was ready, and the narrow stone throat of the stairs meant they could only come at him one at a time. The first man through he took across the shoulder and sent back down. The second got a hand on him in the dark, and there was a bad, close, grunting moment of it, 2 men and a knife in a space too tight to swing, and Silas came out of it with a long burning line opened across his forearm, and the other man not getting up. And then it was the third, the big one, the one who'd been giving the orders in a low harbor front voice, and that one had a pistol. The shot went wide in the dark and struck sparks off the stone by Silas' head, and Silas went in under it, because a man who waits for the second shot in a space like that is a dead man. And the 2 of them went down together onto the cold flags at the base of the tower with the sea roaring outside, and the beam of the light wheeling steady and indifferent through the lantern room high above them both. It was close. Afterwards Silas would not be able to say how close, only that there was a moment on that floor when the big man's weight was on him and the pistol was between them, and it could have gone either way and did not. Because Silas Vane had one thing the hired man did not, which was a reason. High above him a woman was keeping his light burning. She had told him to come back up those stairs, and a man who has been given, after 3 years, one more reason to live, will find in himself, at the bottom of a dark tower with a gun between his ribs, a strength that a man doing it for money simply does not have. The pistol went off once more, into the stone. And then it was over, and Silas Vane got up off the floor of his tower, bleeding and shaking, with 3 men down around him, and the door hanging off its hinges to the dawn wind, and the light still turning overhead. He went up the stairs. She was standing at the lamp when he came into the lantern room, the trimming knife still in her hand, her face turned toward him, and when she saw him, bloody, standing, alive, the whole of her composure broke at once, and she crossed the little room and put her free hand flat against his chest as if to be sure of him, and said only, "You came back up." "I came back up," Silas said. The light never stopped. "No," Eleanor said, and there were tears standing in her eyes and not falling, held there the way she held everything. "It never stopped. The dawn came gray and then gold, the way it did on the good mornings after the bad nights, and out of the north, exactly on her time, came the revenue cutter Walcott, standing down the coast under a plume of coal smoke, and Silas Vane, with his arm bound in a strip of Eleanor, Petticoat and his hands not quite steady, climbed his tower and made the recognition signal, the keeper signal, the heave to, "A man here has intelligence to pass." And the Walcott answered, and slowed, and put down a boat. The officer who came ashore was a lean, spare man of 50 with careful eyes, Lieutenant Warwick of the United States Revenue Cutter Service, and he came up the cliff path from the cradle past 3 bound men and 1 dead one and a shattered door, and he took off his cap in the lantern room and listened. He listened to Silas, keeper of the Sable Point Light, a federal servant of unimpeachable record. He listened to Eleanor Hartley, widow, survivor of the Cormorant. And then he sat down at Silas Vane's kitchen table, and Eleanor opened her husband's chest before him in the morning light for the last time, and Lieutenant Warwick of the Revenue Service went through Thomas Hartley's small exact hand, the charts, the salvage claims, the insurance sums, and last of all the oilcloth-wrapped ledger with 6 years of a rich man's own signature hanging him line by line, and when he was done he sat back and looked at the two of them with an expression that had gone past duty into something like awe. "I have been trying to build a case against Josiah Marsh for 4 years," Lieutenant Warwick said quietly. "We have known ships were being wrecked on this coast that had no business wrecking. We have never once been able to prove a hand behind the weather." He set his own palm flat on the ledger. "This is the hand. This is every piece I have never been able to find. Your husband, Mrs. Hartley, did in a clerk ledger what the whole Revenue Service could not do in 4 years." He looked up. "With this, I can lay Josiah Marsh before a federal court, and there is not a lawyer between here and Washington who can talk him out from under his own signature. The wrecking on this coast is finished. I want you to understand that it's finished, and it's finished because of the two of you, and because," his eyes went for a moment to the tower, to the great lamp standing quiet now in the daylight, "because through the whole of last night, whatever was happening at the foot of it, this light never went dark." Eleanor Hartley pressed her lips together and looked at the ledger and then out the window at the sea that had taken her husband's answer and her ship and 30 souls and had not in the end taken her. "Then let finish it," she said. They took Josiah Marsh 3 days later at his own harbor front office in Dunmore, with the ledger before a federal judge and Lieutenant Warwick and 8 men at his door, and when they told him where the evidence had come from and how it had reached the Revenue Service, up out of the sea on a drowning woman's 2 hands, and through a night of siege in a lighthouse whose keeper would not let the fire go out, Josiah Marsh, who had never once in his life done a thing that put his own neck in the noose, understood that he had at last, and said nothing at all. The wrecking was finished. The false lights were finished. And the families of 30 own souls off the Cormorant, and the families of 5 ships before her, got at last the one thing the sea does not usually give, which is an answer, and a name, and a reckoning. Eleanor Hartley's daughter was born at the Sable Point Light 19 days after the cutter came, on a clear night with the beam wheeling true over calm water and the whole sea for once at peace. It was a long night. Silas, who had delivered goats and nothing more and was frankly terrified, rowed to Dunmore in the afternoon when her pains began and brought back the midwife, Ruth Bell, And the name went through him like a wire when he heard it. Ruth, his daughter, name, and he did not say anything. Only filed it away as one more thing the world does, that a man can either flinch from or not. He chose not to. He stood outside the door of the warm back room through the whole of that long night, while Ruth Bell worked and Eleanor labored. And he did not sit down, and he did not go anywhere, and when at last in the smallest hour before dawn, there came a cry, sharp and furious and gloriously alive. The cry of someone who has arrived in the world and has opinions about it. Silas Vane put his hand flat against the wall of his own house and wept, for the first time in 3 years, without once looking away from it. They let him in when it was done. Eleanor was propped against the pillows, wrung out and shining, with the baby in the crook of her arm, and she looked up at him in the doorway and said, "Come and see her." He crossed the room. The baby was red and cross and had a shocking quantity of dark hair, and her small fists were curled tight against her chest, and Silas Vane looked at her for a long time and could not speak. "Do you want to hold her?" Eleanor said softly. He did. He was afraid to, the way a man is afraid to hold the one thing he cannot bear to drop, but Eleanor showed him how, and he took the child in his bound and calloused hands, and stood there in the lamplight holding a life a few hours old, and something in his chest that had been shut for 3 years came all the way open, all at once, and let in so much light it hurt. "She needs a name," Eleanor said, watching his face and not naming for him what she saw there. He looked at the baby, then carefully at Eleanor. "That's yours to give," he said. "Not mine." "I was thinking," Eleanor said slowly, "of Mary." Silas went very still. "You told me about her," Eleanor said, "your wife, and I've been thinking these last days about all the people we carry. Thomas and your Mary and your Ruth, and how loving them well can mean we stop, or the loss gets the last word. Thomas spent the end of his life making a wrong thing right so that I'd have something to build on, not so I'd stand still in grief forever. And you kept a true light through 3 years of the worst thing a man can carry." Her gray eyes held his over the baby's dark head. "This child is alive because your light was burning on the night the sea meant to take us. It seems right to me that she should carry a name from the both of the people who made that light matter. If you'll allow it." Silas Vane looked down at the baby in his arms. "Mary," and could not for a moment say a single word, and did not need to, because Eleanor Hartley had learned to hear the full weight of the things he did not say. "Mary," he said at last when he could, "it fits." The Walcott called at the Sable Point Light many times in the years that followed, and Lieutenant Warwick, who became a friend, would remark that it was the best kept light on the coast, and the only one, in his experience, where the keeper's wife knew the working of the lamp as well as the keeper did, and where a small girl with a shocking quantity of dark hair and her mother's exact gray eyes could be found, by the time she was old enough to climb up in the lantern room on clear evenings, learning from her father the grave nightly business of keeping a fire burning against the dark. Eleanor married Silas the following spring, plainly, without much ceremony, with Ruth Bell the midwife standing witness and Lieutenant Warwick come ashore in his dress coat for the occasion. And she asked, and Silas agreed without a moment's hesitation, that Thomas Hartley's name be spoken in it, not as an absence, not as an obstacle, but as part of the true story of how the two of them had come to be standing on that rock at all. A careful man who found out why ships were dying, a woman who carried his answer up out of the sea, and a keeper who would not, on the worst night of all, let his light go out, nothing erased, nothing diminished, everything carried forward. On clear nights, when the work was done, the three of them would stand together at the gallery rail, Silas and Eleanor and small Mary between them, and watch the great beam wheel out over the dark water, around and around, steady and true, so that no ship in all that black immensity would ever mistake this rock for anything but what it was. Not a trap, not a lie, not a wrecker's false light showing men their deaths, but a true fire kept by people who had every reason in the world to have stopped believing in it and had chosen, instead and together, to keep it burning. And the sea rose and fell around them the same as always, vast and cold and indifferent to what people wanted, faithful only to the turning of the world, and to the one small light that turned above it, and would not, while these two lived, go dark.